Well, we wanted to spend some time taking our congregations through the last few hours of Jesus's last day. And those last few hours really kick off with what we all know as the Last Supper.
Yeah.
And for many years of my Christian journey, the Last Supper was just the last meal that they ate. It was their Last Supper together.
Sure. Yeah.
I didn't realize that it was a very specific meal that had become the Last Supper until really about a decade ago. I went to my first Passover meal, and it's called a Seder. And the word Seder means order, and that is because for 1,500 years, the nation of Israel annually celebrated their deliverance with a very specific order, a very specific meal with a script associated with it. And it was that Seder, that Passover meal, that Jesus took what was so familiar to the disciples, because they've been doing it their whole lives, and really changed it up and turned it into what is for us as Christians, communion. As a part of the meal, they had an unleavened bread such as this, and there's actually even a line in that Seder script that says, every day we eat bread with yeast or leaven, except today. Why is it today? And then it's discussed that this is a symbol of God's deliverance. It's going to happen quickly. And so Jesus took that bread that they were so used to, meaning deliverance, and then said, this bread actually represents my body, which is going to be broken for you. I mean, imagine what it would have been like for the disciples to say, oh, you're off script.
Right.
What's happening?
Yeah.
And then we have 4 cups of wine here. And as a part of that Passover meal, there are 4 sections to the meal. And each section has a cup of wine. And each cup actually is given a name. And it corresponds to God's miracle coming out of Egypt for the nation of Israel. The first cup would have been drank at the beginning of the meal, and it's called the cup of sanctification. It's because God was saying, I'm setting you apart as my special people. And then the second cup is the cup of the plagues or deliverance, where God is saying, now I'm doing something special with you. Specifically, I'm delivering you. And the scriptures say it was after the meal that Jesus took the third cup, and that cup is called the cup of redemption. And so when Jesus picked up that cup, there was a specific script that was supposed to happen, but he goes off script and says to his disciples, this cup, redemption, this cup is now in my blood. And I would imagine that they were awfully confused, not understanding the significance of what was taking place. And that highlights my own confusion as a believer, having done communion for some 20 years, not understanding the significance of it all.
Yeah. Right. I love that it's called the Last Supper, because I think that even that symbolizes that this is the last time that this is going to mean this.
Right.
This is the last time that this means something other than me.
Right.
I'm starting a new thing.
Right.
What's past is past. This is the last time.
Right. And I was sitting here when he was talking about all that, and I thought about, these guys, if you're a disciple, you've done this one way your entire life. And now this kind of rogue figure has kind of come in a lot of ways, and he's flipping everything around. And the confusion, maybe the wonder, the awe that they would have had as he's explaining all this now, it would have been an amazing thing to be a part of, and being able to put these pieces together.
Yeah, I would hope that from this point forward, all of our people within our churches understand that this act of communion has its roots in a celebration of deliverance that was in Jesus' day 1,500 years. Now, 3,500 years later, we're still celebrating his deliverance in our life every time we do communion.
That's good. That's right.
So we have in front of us now 7 candles, because we are talking through the timeline, the last days of Jesus's life on earth. And we've got 7 segments that we're going to be talking about, with the beginning of the end being this Passover meal.
Mm.
And I can imagine that it was a pretty weighty meal for Jesus, knowing what was coming next. He's talking about a body broken and blood shed, and while the disciples didn't get it, Jesus did.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure it was pretty weighty.
Mm.
And so as part of our celebration of the timeline, it's time for us to remember that a part of his life was coming to a close.
Mm.
So after the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples would have left and they would have made their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think it's important to note that this is a place that Jesus found himself in regularly. Jesus was all about communion with the Father, all about talking with God, all about getting away and having that time to talk with the Father and make sure that he was always in alignment. And so he takes his 12 disciples and pulls out Peter, James, and John, takes them a little farther and says, pray that you won't fall into temptation. And then he goes on and prays by himself and talks with God. And he basically says, Father, if there's a different way, I would love a plan B,
right?
A different option.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important to note that in our humanness, it's not wrong to wish that there were easier ways.
Sure.
But at the end of it, Jesus says, but nevertheless, it's not about my comfort. It's about your plan. It's about me being obedient wherever it takes me. And if this is the plan, if this is the cup you have for me, I drink it. And so we find Jesus in total obedience to the Father, which is a beautiful place where I'd hope we all would be.
What is there to say, though, thinking about now that the position of the disciples at the dinner and all this, and now they're at prayer with Jesus, and there's some comfort in them, and they moved from the dinner and the confusion that they had to now the garden where he says, hey, stay awake with me, and they're like, they don't realize anything now is any different. Like, what's that there? Like, to me, it seems like
there's no immediacy to it.
Right. There's no urgency from them at that point. Although at dinner, Jesus says, I earnestly desire to eat this with you. And he goes through all of that. To me as a disciple, it seems like there's some ebbs and flows, and then all of a sudden it's like pours on for them. And that's an interesting thing that Jesus in the midst of all this is that, I don't know, that they don't see that at that moment.
Yeah, it's so interesting that, before he even makes his way, he says, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and I will be raised.
Yeah.
And then at the table, he uses these elements. He says, this is what's going to happen. Then he tells Judas, go and do what you're going to do. One of you is going to betray me. And yet you're exactly right. They still aren't getting it somehow.
Right.
And which is a scary question to ask ourselves. How many times do we not understand completely what God is doing, and we're kind of on the sidelines falling asleep as well?
Right.
So after he had prayed, Judas, who knew exactly where Jesus would be, because Jesus was always one about going to talk to the Father, came with, it says that it was probably Jewish guards and a few Roman centurions to make sure that there was no trouble. And Jesus is arrested in the garden while praying.
I think that's the point where Peter says, oh, okay. We see it. He gets excited. He gets a little overeager. He gets involved with things. And it's like, I don't know. I just keep wanting to put myself in their shoes of, oh, I wish I would have listened a little sooner. Now let me step in kind of thing. Whereas if he would have just been right next to Jesus where he warned them to be, he encouraged them to be, what I feel like we miss a lot of things because we feel like we can, again, just enjoy Jesus from a distance.
Absolutely.
And there's that there. There's that for us.
Absolutely. I mean, you go back to Matthew 16 when Peter is saying, no, that's not going to happen to you. We're not going to let that happen to you. And to Peter's credit, he is acting upon his conviction. Unfortunately, that's exactly counter what Jesus said is going to happen, what he said has to happen. And Jesus, once again, he stops him in Matthew 16 and he once again stops him there and says, put your sword away. I'm the Prince of Peace. I'm not coming to overthrow the Roman government. There is a bigger thing at play here. I am here to fulfill the will of the Father. I'm here to fulfill this redemption plan that Colossians says was talked about from before time began. And so I cannot let you derail God's plan simply because of your fear or your desire to take up your arm and make things happen. And so we see Judas betraying Jesus, ironically with a kiss, and Jesus once again is left in the hands of others. And so we take the second candle and we understand that Jesus is one step closer to his life and light being snuffed out.
So following that timeline of Jesus' last days, he was taken from the Garden of Gethsemane, and then comes the trial, the denial, and we read about that in the book of John chapter 18. Jen, would you read that for us?
Yeah, verses 25 through 27. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I am not." But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" Again, Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed.
While we were in Jerusalem, we actually were able to do a tour of the high priest's, Caiaphas's house, and underneath is it's called the pit, and it is the jail cell where people were held. And while I was down there, they asked me to read Psalm 88. And while I've read this psalm before, it didn't make near as much meaning to me then as it does now. Psalm 88, Jesus would have known this psalm. Lord, you are the God who saves me. Day and night I cry out to you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. I am overwhelmed with troubles, and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily on me. As Jesus was taking upon his back the wrath of God for all the sin of all mankind. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. Listen to verse 8. You have taken from me my closest friends and have made me repulsive to them. Jesus, I can see him reciting this as Peter, his closest friend, is denying him. What a powerful moment while we were in Jerusalem to see the actual courtyard, to see the steps where Jesus was led after the denial. Very.
I'm always struck with Peter and how he is so extreme. It seems like there's no middle ground for him.
Right.
It's all or nothing. And right now he is in the nothing.
Right.
I don't know him. And yet Jesus already knew that this would happen, that he would deny him. And when I think about Peter and the weight that he must have carried after this moment. Wow, I can't imagine what that would have felt like. That kind of denial for someone that he was watching be led to their death.
In one of the passages, it says their eyes locked.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. I think all of us at some point in our life has had that same moment of decision, and we've denied. I don't know that any of us are not in some way a denier. And yet that denial played a part in Peter's redemption in the end.
I wonder when it says they locked eyes and he wept bitterly. I wonder, I've always seen it as, wow, he's sorry that he betrayed Jesus, but I also wonder if that's the moment when he realized, okay, there's nothing I can do. This is going to happen exactly as Jesus said. And it hit him that we're not going to overthrow the Romans. We're not going to have this Messiah that's going to set things right here, right now. I've got a guy that I've followed for 3.5 years that's going to die. And the death of a dream, the death of the hope of an easier life, on top of this weight of, and I've just denied the guy that I've spent my life following for the last 3 years. Just immense.
It took place in the middle of the night, which is so appropriate because it is often the night seasons that can become great turning points for us if we will allow them to be so. Because for Judas, who was also riddled with guilt in the night season, he chose a completely different path. So in spite of Peter's denial, he is still a great example to us that we still got to keep moving forward. God is a God of forgiveness. And even in our darkest hours, there's still hope. That's good.
It's at this point in the story that the violence really begins against Jesus. Caiaphas and the high priest bring him to Pilate, who is really in charge of all of the interests that are happening in town, and he doesn't want any trouble. So this is really an irritation to him. This is something that he doesn't want to have to deal with. Not tonight. Come on, guys. And so they bring him, and his question is, why are you bringing him to me?
Right.
You know, you deal with him however you want to. This isn't a Roman issue that we're dealing with. This is a Jewish issue that we're dealing with. But Caiaphas and the high priest, they press, and finally Pilate takes Jesus, says, "Come with me." And so he starts to question him. "Who are you? Are you the king?" And Jesus responds, "Well, that's, you say that I'm the king. Is this because this is what you've heard, or do you believe?" And there is a continued exchange between the two of them, and then he decides, well, I'll just take it to the people. Let me see what they have to say about this, because really I don't really want to have to deal with this. And so he goes to the people and says, all right, this is your Passover time, and so it's a tradition that we release someone. Shall I release Jesus or Barabbas? And they yell, "Give us Barabbas." And in my translation, they put in, "You should know that Barabbas was a terrorist."
Right. Right.
And so they ask for Barabbas instead. And it's at that point that we read that Pilate took Jesus and he had him flogged. And they twisted together a crown of thorns, really as a way to humiliate him. And they wrapped him in a purple cloth, and then it just continued. The humiliation, the egging on, everything just continued and seemed to build from that point. Is this your king? Is this your king? Finally, they start to yell out, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate and Jesus would have an exchange, but Jesus stopped speaking to him. I mean, I don't know if he could speak at that point, but he didn't answer back, which really irritated Pilate.
Sure.
Don't you know who I am? I have your life in my hands. Why don't you answer my questions? And so this is how it reads in Scripture. "How can you ignore me? Are you not aware that I have the authority either to free you or crucify you?" And Jesus said, "Any authority you have over me comes from above, not from your political position. Because of this, the one who handed me to you is guilty of the greater sin." Pilate listened to Jesus' words, taking them to heart. He attempted to release Jesus, but the Jews opposed him, shouting, "If you release this man, you have betrayed Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king threatens Caesar's throne. And then they continue to yell, crucify him. What's going on in this passage is also this political struggle, this play for power, that the people who were in charge of the Jews, the high priests, they didn't want to take responsibility for the death of Jesus, especially during this time of the year.
Right.
They didn't want to take on that responsibility, and yet they were guilty, just as Jesus said.
And this would have been late, I guess early Friday morning now.
This is
super early.
Yeah, early in the morning. And so it was a time when I don't know how many people were gathered at that point in the day.
Yeah.
So it could have been a smaller group that really had a hand in saying this is going to be the fate of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty powerful.
I think what I'm struck with here is really the politics that are involved. I'm struck with how no one wanted to take responsibility for it. Everyone wanted to wash their hands of it, and yet it kept going on. And what these people, what the Jewish leaders did was they twisted Pilate's arm to say, if you don't do this, then what you're doing is you are betraying your king, who is Caesar. So you have to do this.
Right.
And so it was at this point that they led Jesus to be crucified. Pilate handed him over to his soldiers, knowing that this would happen. He would be crucified.
Jesus has just left Pilate. It's about maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. And Pilate has just sent him off to go be crucified, essentially. It's interesting. One thing that he says before he sends him off is he writes a sign that's going to hang above Jesus' cross. And it says, "This is the King of the Jews." And the priests look at him and they say, "You can't write that." And Pilate has his own kind of redemption moment. And he says, "What I have written is what I've written." And it's kind of that moment where you realize he has seen who Jesus is, but his hands are tied in a lot of ways. And he sends him off, and this is what it says in Mark, and it says, Mark 15:16, "And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews.' And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him." And they were really mocking him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes back on him and led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, to carry the cross. And the thing about the cross is it was the absolute worst way that you could die. There was no other way. It was designed to be the worst. It was designed to be bloody. It was designed to be painful. But more than all those things, it was designed to be shameful. And that's the point that Pilate was saying, says, this man has done nothing. Let me release him. But instead, they decided they wanted to put all that shame on him. I mean, so much that a battalion of soldiers, that's like 400 to 600 soldiers, are mocking one person. And every effort that they have is just to put all the shame on him, make him feel little, make him feel like he's nothing. He's already been beaten to beyond recognition, is what the Bible says, that his own mother wouldn't have recognized him. And so all of this is about shame. And one writer put this about the crown. It says, "He wore the crown of thorns, which we deserved, that we might wear the crown of glory that he merited." He took our shame. He endured our suffering. He did all of this. And again, back into Luke, he says, "I eagerly desire this." It's not, I don't want to die. I don't want to do the pain, but I will do this so that we can experience that redemption that he is walking himself toward. And that's what I gather from this part. He endured all this. He didn't have to. He could have called down heaven and said, "I can't." But instead he said, "No, I want to and I will," for every single one of us. And it's that enduring of him laboring toward the cross and literally being led to the slaughter that we read in all this, and that we carry that weight of this, that Jesus did this for us. He did this for you and me. He did this for everybody we come in contact with. He endured this. And it's, when I think on that, it overwhelms me in a lot of ways. You know, when you do the research and you realize what he went through, that cat of nine tails and how they designed it, the crown of thorns and the cross, I mean, it's overwhelming to think about that.
To think about all of that, and then he had to carry his cross.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't a short walk.
Right. And as if it wasn't enough.
Yeah. The idea when we walked in Jerusalem, I can tell you what was most amazing is how long and how uphill it was. And I'm carrying a backpack and I'm sweating, having to stop for a glass of water.
Mm-hmm.
The thought of Jesus enduring all of that for us, for enduring his shame because we are the ones who are shameful.
Mm.
Enduring his humiliation because we are the ones who've humiliated our God our whole lives.
I feel like this is the part in the story where we most clearly see our desperate state. I think of Bonhoeffer that talks about cheap sin brings cheap grace. And when we justify things, when we make light of things, it's easy to justify things. But when you see the weight of our sin and what it looks like when it's placed upon him, and the measure of pain and suffering and what Jesus was willing to go through, that merits a deep sense of our sin and a deep sense of God's grace. And we see it beautifully in this passage. Just what Jesus was willing to do for us.
That's right. Yeah. And he carried all of that to the cross. He, step by step, every thought in his head was, I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for you. And he literally walked to the place where they were going to nail his hands to the cross. And he laid down willingly.
In our time frame, we find that it's around noon. So Jesus has not slept since early Thursday morning. He's exhausted. He's been beaten beyond recognition. He's been forced to carry a beam that was extremely heavy for a regular person, let alone someone who's gone through what he's gone through. He's led up to the cross, and he is nailed there and elevated up on this stake. And he's put in between two criminals who are justly hanging there.
Sure.
Two people who are getting what they deserve, and yet then you have Jesus in the middle, who is the innocent lamb that's willingly climbing onto the cross, as it were. We see so many things happening at that point. We see Jesus crying out because he's thirsty. We see him being mocked, not only by the Romans, but by the religious leaders. And I can't imagine what that would have been like, but I can just picture these leaders saying, we finally got you.
Sure.
We've been trying for years.
Yeah.
You finally stepped across a line that we could nail you for. And I can't imagine their joy at the foot of this cross, where this Messiah is dying for them,
right?
Even in that state.
Right.
It's just overwhelming.
It is.
So in the timeline, Jesus is on that cross for some 3 hours after everything you've just described. And for us, that's noontime. So what if we, at noon, hit our phone, hit a timer for 3 hours and really just embraced the reality that Jesus is dying over the course of these 3 hours for us. We could look down at our timer. I've got 2 more hours. I've got an hour. Jesus' life slowly eking away this entire time.
And they say that just the effort for him to be able to breathe would have been him pushing up on those nails from his feet just to lift his lungs up enough to catch a breath.
Right.
Do that for 3 hours.
Yeah.
We struggle, to walk up a set of stairs sometimes, we feel like we're out of breath, or to, run a little bit, just the effort that takes.
Yeah.
And he was literally struggling and pushing just to be able to take breaths. For 3 hours, he endured that.
And so it's in this extreme pain, this extreme setting by a ruthless pagan nation that is crucifying this innocent person, that we see Jesus coming to his final moments before his death.
So as we finish up our timeline, we finish it with the last words of Jesus, the death of Jesus. In the book of John, chapter 19, verse 28, Jesus knew that his mission was now finished. And to fulfill scripture, he said, I am thirsty. A jar of sour wine was sitting there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put it on a hyssop branch, and held it to his lips. When Jesus had tasted it, he said, it is finished. Then he bowed his head and released his spirit. It is finished. His work was finally done. But at the cost of his own life, so that our new life could just get started. It says darkness was on the earth. It says the temple veil was torn, rocks were split. It is as though all of creation itself shuddered in those moments. We read in the book of Revelation that even all of heaven was silent. It was a moment that was transformational for all of creation. I would say even the universe itself shuddered in those last moments. It was for you and I, so that we could live forever. His death equals our life.
I love that in the book of Hebrews it talks about the sacrifice that is once and for all.
Yeah.
Once and for all.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of run those together a lot of times, but it was done once, and it is for us all.
I also love how it says back in John, he says he gave up his spirit. It wasn't taken from him.
Right.
This is something he did. This is something he chose to do, even up to the point of his very last breath. And he did it for us.
Yeah.
That's an awe moment for me.
Yeah. It's hard to look at that level of love and sacrifice and not be drawn to it.
Right.
And I often have heard people say they've rejected the Lord, and I think, no, you've just not seen how much he really loves you. You just need to take a few moments to put yourself at that cross in that day, in those last few moments, and see what he did for you. He gave it